All right, AP AFRAM, this is our last topic for Unit 1, and it's one that we can go through very quickly. So let's get to it. So for this topic, really, we're going to rely on the required AP source. This is a painting, and it's titled Chafferie de El Rey, and the translation of that is the King's Fountain. They believe it was produced somewhere between 1570 and 1580, so we're looking at 16th century. This is oil paint on panel, and it's 93 by 163 centimeters. And this is a very busy painting. There's a lot of information here, and you can't just glance at it and understand what's happening. You really need to take it in like a story. So you need to spend some time observing. When you're observing, ask yourself, what do you see? And what is this painting showing us? What is this painting trying to communicate? What do I need to walk away with after spending time observing? In your observation of this painting, there's some questions that I want to put out there for you to help kind of guide you in your observation. First, I want you to take note of the architecture. Okay, architecture can reveal a lot about like geographical location, culture, sometimes religion. So it's very, very telling just by looking at the architectural surroundings. So when we look at what we have here in this painting, this is not typical architecture that we would be finding in Africa. This is not mud brick. It's not thatched roofs. It's not, a stone enclosure like Great Zimbabwe. So then the question is this even Africa? And if it's not Africa, then where do you think we are? Also notice that it's kind of like a city scene, but it's up against water as well. And so that tells us that, maybe this is coastal. Is this a river? You need to kind of question where the land meets the water. What is that telling us? And in the water, you need to notice what's going on. We're seeing lots of boats. We're seeing people in boats. We're seeing a man coming out of a boat, carrying something heavy. So we need to start, putting together, like, what do we think is going on here between the land and the water? And then, of course, you need to look at the people, and there's a lot of people to look at, so this takes time. But ask yourself these questions. What do you notice about, first of all, clothing? How about gender? And definitely race. Don't just acknowledge that maybe there's more than one race or there's boys and girls, right? But try to notice, like, what about the males versus the females? What are the males doing versus the females? The same with race. What about it? What are the interactions between the races or within the races? What does that look like? Or the genders. So start to kind of look at all these little areas of this painting and see like what these people are doing, how they're interacting, and how they're kind of mixed together. Another thing that is easy to pick up with your eye because of color is, what do you think about all these red ceramic jugs? If you look closely, you're going to see all these spots of red, and you're going to see a bunch of these ceramic jugs being kind of carried around. And then ask yourself, well, who is mostly carrying the red jugs? And then once you kind of recognize who is carrying the red jugs, like, why do you think that is? And then does it have anything at all to do with the title of the artwork? And if it does, what are your assumptions? What about that correlation? There's also animals. There's a dog, there's horse, there's also a pony, and there's also a donkey. And it may be hard to tell the difference between them without looking very closely and looking at their color and their size difference. And then I said there's a lot of little areas in the painting, and that is true. You have kind of this area in the back right corner where, there's a scene going on here. We have this extreme foreground in the boats. We have this middle ground that stretches across the painting. Okay, that's its own separate scene. We have some of this centered scene where this person in isolation is very much one of the center focal points. And it's a lot because he is isolated. And then also pay attention to his figure and his stance. I find that also very interesting. And then there's some things happening kind of on the left side. And then don't forget to take a peek at the architecture. There's windows here and there's things happening in the windows. So there's just a lot going on. You need to move your eye around, pause at each scene, and try to see what you're seeing. And, you'll come up with a lot of questions. So now let's get into some of those details and see if we can kind of start explaining the things that you need to know about this painting and what the reason why AP AFRAM chose this artwork to be part of, one of its sources. So overall, Chaffarí de El Rey is basically an important record. It's a historical account that is recording the varied lives, the labors, the punishments, and the cultural activities, specifically of Black Portuguese people in early modern Lisbon. So let's just start with Lisbon. If you did not know, Lisbon is actually the capital of Portugal. And I've put down here, some geography. So Portugal and Spain, together, those two countries during this era was called kind of the Iberian Peninsula. So you're going to see that often referred to Iberia or the Iberians. And when you see that term, that's what it means. It's kind of like Portugal and Spain combined. Okay. But this painting is specific to Portugal and then even more specific to Lisbon. So a couple things I want you to notice is Lisbon is actually on the coast, right? So that would explain where the land meets the water. And not only is it on the coast, but it was one of the largest of three port towns. Okay, so that's important information. What I also want you to take note of, if you haven't done that, is I want you to look at the close proximity to Northern Africa. Okay, so right up here we've got Morocco, and then, over here on the other side, we would start to get to Egypt. Okay, but this is the top portion of Africa, and it's close proximity. Okay, so now that you've kind of learned the overall purpose of this painting, now you can look at it maybe a little differently, maybe with a little bit more educated eyes. Okay, so what we're going to do is break down some of these scenes that I pointed out to you so you can get some of the important facts needed for this source. All right, we're going to start in that upper kind of right-hand corner. And what we have here is a festive scene. So this is like dancing, music, socialization, congregation. And if you look very, very closely, there's some interesting things that you can take note of. One is right here in the center. We see a black man dancing with a white woman, which is very interesting. Okay. But we also have, a black couple that's also dancing as well. What we're also seeing is a lot of red jugs over here. Look at all those red jugs, right? And what are they doing with those jugs? Where are they going with those jugs? And if you notice here in the background, this is where all the people are taking their jugs. Okay, so if you're looking correctly, what you're seeing here is water coming out of these animal fountains. So remember the title of the fountain. Okay, when you translate it, it's titled the King's Fountain. So something important about that is, remember, this is 16th century, so there isn't plumbing or running water inside people's houses. They have to fetch water and bring it back to their homestead. You know that a kingdom, a city, a country, whatever you want to segregate it as, is doing well when they have public water sources. And that's exactly what this is. So the King's Fountain is a public water source where people who live in close proximity can bring their water jugs, collect their water, and then bring it back to their homestead. Okay, so that kind of helps bring the name of the painting into, what's happening in the painting. But again, if you notice, okay, really, who are the people carrying the jugs? And how are they carrying the jugs? What does that tell us? So we see a lot of black women carrying the jugs. We see the black women carrying the jugs on their heads. What we know about that is a common custom in Africa. So these are probably African women. Why aren't the white women carrying jugs, right? Why aren't the white men carrying jugs? So that helps us understand some roles that are happening here. Okay. So we're also going to look at these two scenes, these two portions of the painting that kind of outlines some of the cruelty and some of the punishments that are outlined in this painting. So on the upper left-hand square that I pointed out earlier, we see some violence with some Afro lesbiotas, and they were subjected to some cruelty. And in a very significant image right here at the center of the painting, we see a black man. We see the jug that's actually over his head, right? And then we see some things kind of falling around him, and they're red in color. So that could be portions of the jug, like broken portions of the jug. We see some brown, brush strokes around it, which could maybe represent the water that's pouring out. Some art historians see the red as perhaps blood, or, the kind of act of bleeding. There's different opinions about that. But the fact that this jug, right, has been shoved violently over his head is kind of a act of, how the different races were treated. And what I find more interesting is that the painter, again, isolated this person. And then that question is why? What does that isolation mean? Nobody's around him. He's not within a crowd. He becomes a focal point for that reason. So why does the artist want us to make sure we notice this person out of all the people that are in the painting? But then I also find it quite interesting, the pose of the figure. It's almost like an orant pose, but to me, it also kind of reminds me a little bit of the pose that you would have in a crucifixion. So all of those little hints and little subtleties make you stop, think, and wonder when you're interpreting. Then a little bit lower underneath him, there's another scene of violence where we have a Black man that's being carried away by some sort of authority figure. We're seeing the Black man looking, very helpless, kind of in a subdued and submissive type of pose, but behind him we see a Black woman that has her arms kind of reached out, like confused and shocked, like what is happening, what is going on. That's possibly his wife, and it's a scene that is not so unfamiliar today. We've talked about the very, very foreground and the water and all of the boats. And what AP really wants you to kind of take away from that is definitely the Black man coming out of the boats carrying something on his shoulder. And then also this Black man here, who is actually, he's a gondola. He's the one that is rowing the boat, controlling the boat, and it's a little bit cut off here, but the people that he's rowing are actually a white couple. And so what AP wants you to notice here is these are some of our laborers. So this person is probably bringing goods to sell for market, or bringing goods back to where he works for his Portuguese owner. This is a laborer who is working some sort of service job. So again, kind of taking in all the different aspects of the Black Portuguese during this time period. But then a really interesting part of the painting, which is almost like a juxtaposition of what we've been discussing here with the Black Portuguese, is we do see 4 Black knights. They're identifiable by their attire, by their clothing, and also they have swords, they have emblems that represent their knighthood. 2 of them are walking on foot, and then you have one knight that you can only see from behind him. You can only see his back, and he's riding a gray donkey. And then there's a more prominent knight that is riding a pony. Okay, well, this is an actual person. So historically, when you look back, this Black knight riding a pony is an actual person that is identified as João de Sá Panasco. Okay, so he goes by Sá, and he was born in West Africa. He was enslaved by the Portuguese when he was a teenager. When he got to Portugal as a teenager, in the slave trade, a powerful Portuguese aristocrat who was also named João de Sá. Okay, it was very, very common for slave owners to rename their enslaved people. But anyways, this aristocrat bought him, but then later freed him in the 1540s. And the Black Sa then went on to serve, once he was freed, he went on to serve in the royal court of King John III. And his job first was a jester, so he was there to entertain the king, and then eventually kind of moved up the ranks as a page. For doing a service so well and for such a commitment, King John actually made Black Sa a knight for his service to the crown. And this is very uncommon. Mostly knights were, a bloodline. But then there is, historical data that shows that really a king did have the power to knight anybody they wanted as just kind of like an honorable action. And so the importance of having these knights in the painting was that it did demonstrate that Black Portuguese people could reach an elite social status in early modern Portugal. Okay. Now, it was not common. All right. So I want to make that very clear. It was not common, but was possible. But at the same time, you also must note that the knights in this painting, that they were only allowed donkeys and ponies. Okay, so they were not allowed the large, majestic horses available to the other knights. So after reviewing our source, really these are our takeaways. These are our conclusions for 1.11. So the first learning objective: why did Africans go to the Iberian Peninsula? And why did Europeans go to Africa before the transatlantic slave trade? So we already know this. We know this from previous topics, but we know that trade increased dramatically between West Africa and Portugal between 15th and 16th centuries. And because of that alone, it brought Europeans to Africa and it brought Africans to Europe, simply for the act of trading goods. But we also know that part of those goods, West Africa participated in the slave trade. It brought enslaved Africans to Europe that way. And even though West Africa saw kind of sharing their domestic slave trade with the Europeans, and that it actually was very bountiful and fruitful to these kingdoms and bringing them lots of wealth and lots of exposure to other European countries, which was, connecting them globally. We also know that eventually it got extremely out of hand. The other thing is African elites. Okay, so outside of trading goods, outside of the slave trade, African elites did indeed travel to port cities in Europe for diplomatic purposes, for educational purposes, and religious reasons. We are well aware that a lot of African kingdoms went through religious conversions. So through Christianity and through Islam, the furthering of being trained in those religions or traveling to some of the origins of those religions meant that African elites were, going to Europe and, traveling more globally. Learning objective 1.11b then asks, well, how did early forms of enslaved labor by the Portuguese begin to shape slave-based economies in America? So remember, we're always trying to connect what we learn from this first unit to America. That is what this course is about. It is about African Americans and we try not to lose sight of that. We try to look at the history and see how it has affected and how it has, culturally developed our African Americans. So what we do know is this is kind of the in-between period before the transatlantic slave trade. And that is never, ever discussed. We oftentimes, when we talk about African Americans, we start with slavery. And when we start with slavery, we start with the transatlantic. But we are learning there's more to the story than that. And so that is what topic 1.11 conclusions wants you to really hover over and understand, that the Portuguese colonized a lot of African kingdoms, and it was really the start of the Atlantic islands, specifically two of them, Cabo Verde and Sao Tome, where in these islands, after the Portuguese conquered and colonized these islands, they began to grow plantation crops like cotton, indigo, which is a plant used for fabric dye, and sugar. Okay. And in those islands, they were using the labor of enslaved Africans. These plantations then literally became a model for slave labor-based economies in the Americas. So these little islands, I gave you a little map here. So Cabo Verde they're both on the west coast, but Cabo Verde is more north, kind of adjacent to Mali, right, and Senegal. And then, see, here's Morocco, so it's more on the northern part. But the Sao Tome is kind of right here in this armpit, okay, this little island. So those islands became the perfect model for the perfect storm. And as these plantations grew and the need for supply grew, like, more people wanted cotton, more people needed sugar, these became products that were exported and brought wealth to the area. As that continued to grow globally, the need for slave labor continued to grow. And that need, unfortunately, was going to be met no matter how they had to meet that. And then that became the preface for the transatlantic slave trade. So that is the end of topic 1.11. That is the end of unit 1. Hopefully you're going to be able to look back at this unit and feel like you have a better understanding of the history and the origin of African American culture. And I wish you very good luck on our first unit test.